The letter arrived at dawn, and Eliza Hart's hands shook so badly she could barely break the seal. £300. That was the number written in black ink at the bottom of the page, the amount her late father owed to a merchant named Coleman, and the date by which it had to be paid was only 6 weeks away. She sat at the small wooden table in her family's cottage, staring at the number until the letters blurred, and she knew there was only one way to keep her family from losing everything. She would have to leave home and take the position she had been offered at Ashcombe Castle. Her mother wept when she heard the news, and her younger brother Edward, only 14, tried to act brave, though his eyes betrayed his fear. Eliza packed a single bag that evening, folding her 2 dresses with careful hands, and told herself she would not cry. Crying would not pay a debt. Only work would. The carriage ride to the castle took most of the day, and by the time she arrived, the sky had turned the color of a bruise, purple and gray, and the castle itself rose out of the hills like something out of an old story, tall and cold and unwelcoming. A woman named Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper, met her at the servants' entrance, looking her over with sharp eyes. "You're the new girl," Mrs. Whitfield said. It was not a question. "You'll start in the East Wing. Keep your head down, do your work, and do not speak to His Grace unless he speaks to you first. Do you understand?" Eliza nodded, though the warning made her stomach twist. She had heard stories about the Duke of Ashcombe, Julian, before she ever set foot on his land. The villagers spoke of him in careful whispers, calling him a hard man, a man who had dismissed servants for the smallest mistakes, a man who trusted no one, since his father's death left him the estate, and all its troubles at a young age. She told herself it did not matter what kind of man he was. She was not here to be liked, she was here to survive. Her first days blurred together in exhaustion. She rose before the sun and scrubbed floors until her knees ached, carried water up 4 flights of stairs, and mended linens by candlelight long after the other servants had gone to bed. She skipped her own meals more than once, wrapping the bread in a cloth instead, and hiding it away, because every coin she could save meant 1 coin closer to saving her family's cottage. No one noticed. That was how she preferred it. On the 5th night, she could not sleep. Her mind kept circling back to the letter, to the number 300, to the sound of her mother crying, and she found herself wandering the halls long after she should have been in bed. She told herself she only wanted air, but her feet carried her toward the library, where a single candle still burned, and the smell of old paper and leather filled the room, like a memory of somewhere safer. She had loved books once, before her father's death, before the debts, before her whole world became about survival instead of living. She could not resist stepping inside. She had barely opened the cover of a worn novel when the door behind her creaked, and she froze. "I was told the staff were forbidden from this room." The voice was low and even, and when she turned, she found herself looking at a man she recognized instantly, though she had never seen him this close. Julian Ashcombe stood in the doorway, tall and unsmiling, dressed simply for the hour, his dark hair slightly disordered, as though he too had been unable to sleep. His eyes moved from her face to the book in her hands, and something in his expression hardened. "Forgive me, Your Grace." Eliza set the book down at once and stepped back, her heart pounding. "I did not mean to trespass. I could not sleep, and I saw the light, and you were reading." He said it flatly, as though the idea offended him. Servants who cannot follow simple rules do not last long in this house. "I understand. It will not happen again." She kept her eyes down, the way Mrs. Whitfield had instructed, though everything in her wanted to defend herself, to explain that she had done nothing wrong, except seek a few minutes of quiet in a house that gave her none. But she had learned, in 6 days, that explanations were a luxury she could not afford. Julian studied her a long moment, and there was something unreadable behind his gray eyes, something that was not quite anger, though it was close enough to frighten her. "What is your name?" "Eliza Hart, Your Grace." "Hart?" He repeated it slowly, as though testing the weight of it. "Go to bed, Miss Hart, and do not let me find you here again." She fled the library without another word, her face burning with humiliation, and she did not sleep at all that night. She lay awake replaying the encounter over and over, certain she would be dismissed by morning, certain her one chance to save her family had ended before it truly began. But morning came, and no summons arrived. She was still employed. Still, She could not shake the feeling that the Duke's eyes had followed her longer than they should have, that his anger had not been as simple as it seemed. Over the following days, Eliza kept her distance from the family wing entirely, terrified of crossing paths with him again. She threw herself into her work instead, scrubbing harder, moving faster, trying to become invisible in the only way she knew how. But invisibility, she was beginning to learn, was not so easy to achieve in a house where everyone watched everyone else. It was Charlotte, one of the older maids, who first warned her. "You want to be careful," Charlotte said one afternoon, as they folded linens together in the laundry room. "The other girls are already talking about you." "Talking about what?" Eliza asked, though dread pooled in her stomach. "About the library. About the Duke finding you there." Charlotte lowered her voice. "Word travels fast in this house, Eliza. Faster than you'd like." Eliza's hands stilled over the linen. "It was nothing. A mistake. I was reading, that is all." "I believe you." Charlotte's expression softened. But belief does not stop gossip, and gossip does not stop dismissal. "Just be careful. His Grace has let girls go for less than a rumor." That night, lying in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, Eliza thought of her mother's face, of Edward trying to be brave, of the merchant Coleman and his letter with its cruel deadline. She could not afford to be dismissed. She could not afford rumors, or mistakes, or anything at all that might cost her this position. She promised herself she would be more careful. She would become the most obedient, most unremarkable servant the castle had ever seen, and she would save every coin until the debt was paid and her family was safe. She did not know, as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, that the Duke of Ashcombe was lying awake in his own chambers at that very moment, thinking of a servant girl, with tired eyes and a stubborn chin, who had not begged or wept when he caught her breaking his rules, who had simply accepted her fate with a quiet dignity he had not expected from anyone in his household in a very long time. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself he would forget her by morning. He did not. The next week brought rain, endless gray rain that turned the castle grounds to mud and kept the servants scrambling to keep water from seeping beneath the doors. Eliza worked from before dawn until well past dark, her hands raw, her back aching, and still she pressed on, because every day she remained employed was a day closer to saving her family. She barely noticed when Mrs. Whitfield began assigning her to duties near the family wing, tasks that placed her closer to the Duke than she had been before. She told herself it was simply chance, the natural rotation of a housemaid's work. She did not yet understand that nothing in that house happened entirely by chance. She saw him twice that week, once in the corridor outside his study, where he passed her without a word, his eyes flickering briefly to her face before moving on, and once in the dining hall, where she had been sent to deliver a message from the housekeeper. He was seated at the long table, alone, a stack of ledgers before him, his expression drawn and tired in a way she had not expected from a man so wealthy, so powerful. For a moment, watching him rub his temple as he stared at columns of numbers, she almost felt something close to sympathy. Then she remembered herself, delivered her message, and left as quickly as her feet would carry her. She did not know that the ledgers before him that night concerned her own family's debt, that he had already begun quietly making inquiries about a merchant named Coleman and a widow named Hart, in a village 3 days' ride from the castle. She did not know that the cold, unreadable Duke of Ashcombe, the man everyone warned her to avoid, had not stopped thinking of her since the night in the library, and that something in her quiet courage had cracked open a part of him he had long believed closed for good. All she knew, as she climbed into bed that night, exhausted and aching, was that 6 weeks remained before Coleman's deadline, and she was no closer to £300 than she had been the day she arrived. She closed her eyes and pushed the fear down where it could not stop her from working, and she told herself, as she had told herself every night since her father's death, that she would find a way. She always found a way. She had no other choice. The rain finally stopped after a week, and with it came a strange shift in the rhythm of the castle. Eliza noticed it first in small ways. A basket of firewood she had struggled to carry the day before had somehow already been moved to her station by the time she arrived. A broken latch on the linen closet, one she had complained about quietly to Charlotte, was suddenly repaired. She told herself these were coincidences, the ordinary maintenance of a large household, but a small voice in the back of her mind refused to believe it. Then came the matter of the boots. Her own shoes had worn through at the sole weeks ago, and she had been stuffing the gaps with folded cloth to keep the cold from creeping in during her long hours on stone floors. She had said nothing about it to anyone, ashamed of the state of her belongings, determined to endure until she could afford a new pair. One morning, a plain, sturdy pair of boots appeared outside her door, wrapped in brown paper with no note attached. They fit as though they had been made for her exact foot. "Where did these come from?" she asked Charlotte, holding them up as though they might bite her. Charlotte's eyebrows rose. "I couldn't say. Perhaps Mrs. Whitfield ordered new boots for the staff. She did not mention it to anyone else. Then perhaps someone requested them for you specifically." Charlotte's tone carried a knowing lilt that made Eliza's cheeks warm. "Don't be ridiculous," Eliza said quickly, though the thought had already crossed her mind, unwelcome and impossible to dismiss. She wore the boots anyway, because her feet ached too much to refuse practicality for pride, but she wore them with a nagging unease, as though accepting them meant accepting something larger she did not yet understand. Julian, for his part, told himself he had only ordered new boots because a servant limping through her duties served no one, least of all the smooth running of his household. It was a practical decision, nothing more. He repeated this to himself so often over the following days that he nearly believed it. But practicality alone did not explain why he found himself, 3 days later, standing at the window of his study and watching Eliza cross the courtyard below, her new boots steady on the wet stones, her chin lifted despite the heavy basket balanced against her hip. It did not explain why he found himself remembering, at odd moments during the day, the particular way she had refused to make excuses for herself in the library, when a lesser servant would have wept and begged for mercy. It did not explain the strange, unfamiliar warmth that settled in his chest each time her name crossed his mind. He was a careful man. He had built his life on caution since the day his father died, and left him an estate, drowning in debts of its own, debts he had spent a decade quietly repairing, while presenting a face of cold control to the world, because a duke who showed weakness was a duke who invited ruin. He could not afford distraction. He especially could not afford a distraction in the form of a housemaid with tired eyes and a stubborn spirit who had no idea how completely she had unsettled him. And yet, he began finding reasons to walk through the East Wing during her working hours. He told himself he was inspecting the renovations. He began asking Mrs. Whitfield small, careful questions about the new girl's conduct, framing them as concerns about the household's efficiency. He told himself he was simply a thorough employer. When Mrs. Whitfield mentioned, almost in passing, that the girl skipped her midday meal, more often than not, something in Julian went very still. "Skips her meal," he repeated. "Why?" "I couldn't say, Your Grace. Perhaps she prefers to work through it." He did not believe that for a moment. He had seen enough hunger in his lifetime, in the years before his family's fortune was restored, to recognize its shadow in another person's eyes. He remembered the particular thinness of Eliza's wrists, the way her uniform hung slightly loose at the shoulders, details he had not consciously catalogued until that moment, but which now assembled themselves into a picture he did not like at all. That evening, without explaining himself to anyone, he instructed the kitchen staff that all servants were to be given a proper midday meal without exception, and that any servant found skipping meals should be reported to him directly, as it reflected poorly on the household's care for its staff. It was, he told himself, simply good management. He did not mention that the policy had been inspired by a single housemaid whose hunger he could not stop thinking about. Eliza noticed the change immediately, of course. The kitchen staff began setting aside a proper plate for her each day, insisting she eat before returning to her duties, and when she asked why the sudden attention, the cook only shrugged and said the order had come from the housekeeper. Eliza did not think to question it further, though a small, persistent suspicion continued to gnaw at her, one she pushed away each time it surfaced, because entertaining it felt dangerous in ways she could not fully name. It was Charlotte, blunt as always, who finally said aloud what Eliza refused to consider. "You know it's him, don't you?" Charlotte said one evening, as they sat together mending torn linens by candlelight. "The boots, the meals, even old Whitfield has noticed how often he asks after you." "He does not ask after me." Eliza's needle paused mid-stitch. "He barely acknowledges my existence." "That's precisely why it's strange. Charlotte leaned closer, lowering her voice, though they were alone. He never asks after any of us. Not once in the 2 years I've worked here has His Grace inquired whether a maid was eating properly. And now, suddenly, the moment you arrive, he cares whether the whole staff has boots and bread. Eliza, that is not coincidence. That is a man noticing someone. You're imagining things, but even as she said it, Eliza felt her pulse quicken, and she hated herself a little for it. Because noticing was dangerous, and being noticed by a man like Julian Ashcombe was more dangerous still. She had a family to save. She had a debt hanging over her like a blade, and she could not afford to let herself hope for anything beyond survival. Least of all, something as foolish and fragile as the attention of a duke. Just be careful, Charlotte said again, echoing her earlier warning, though this time her tone carried something gentler, something almost sympathetic. Men like him do not simply notice a girl for nothing. Either it means something real, which could ruin you both, or it means nothing at all, and you'll break your own heart hoping otherwise. There is no safe road here, Eliza. Eliza said nothing, because she did not know how to answer. That night, she lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling of the small room she shared with 2 other maids, listening to their steady breathing, and she allowed herself, just for a moment, to remember the exact shade of gray in Julian's eyes the night he found her in the library. She remembered the way his anger had not quite reached those eyes, the way something else had lingered there instead, something she had been too frightened to name at the time. She pushed the thought away as quickly as it came. She could not afford it. £300 still hung over her family, and 5 weeks remained before Coleman's deadline arrived. Whatever strange kindness had begun weaving itself quietly through her days at Ashcombe Castle, she told herself firmly, it changed nothing about the debt, and it changed nothing about her purpose here. She had come to work, to save, to survive. She would not let herself become distracted by a man's kindness, however unexpected, however much it made her chest ache, in ways she did not fully understand. 2 days later, Mrs. Whitfield summoned her unexpectedly to the housekeeper's office, and Eliza's stomach dropped with dread, certain she had done something wrong, certain her position was about to be taken from her after all. His Grace has requested that you assist with cataloging the library, Mrs. Whitfield said, her tone carefully neutral, though her eyes studied Eliza with unmistakable curiosity. He says you have a fine hand for organizing books, based on what he observed the night he found you there. Eliza's mouth went dry. I do not understand, Mrs. Whitfield. I thought I was forbidden from the library. Apparently His Grace has reconsidered. The housekeeper's expression remained unreadable, though something in her voice suggested she found the entire situation as puzzling as Eliza did. You are to report there each afternoon, after your regular duties are complete. Do not be late, and do not disappoint him. Eliza left the office in a daze, her mind racing through every possible explanation, none of which felt safe to consider for long. She told herself it was simply a task, an assignment like any other, nothing more than the practical use of a servant who happened to read well. She told herself this all the way to the library door that afternoon, and she continued telling herself this, even as her heart pounded against her ribs, and even as she pushed open the heavy door to find Julian Ashcombe already waiting inside, a small stack of books beside him, and an expression on his face that looked, for the briefest moment, almost like relief. The afternoons in the library became the strangest part of Eliza's days, and also, though she would not admit it easily, the part she began to anticipate most. Julian said little at first, giving her instructions in short, formal sentences, directing her to sort volumes by subject and repair torn spines with careful thread. But as the days passed, the silence between them began to soften into something else, something neither of them named but both seemed to feel. He asked her, one afternoon, which book she had been reading the night he found her. She told him, expecting judgment, but instead, he pulled the very volume from the shelf and set it on the table between them without a word, as though offering permission she had not thought to ask for. She read a chapter aloud at his request one evening, her voice unsteady at first, then growing more confident as he listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken in a way she refused to examine too closely. She learned things about him she had not expected, that he had inherited an estate crushed by his father's poor decisions and had spent a decade quietly rebuilding it, stone by stone, ledger by ledger, trusting almost no one in the process, that the coldness the villagers spoke of was not cruelty but exhaustion, the armor of a man who had been betrayed too many times to risk softness again. She began to understand, in fragments, why he guarded himself so carefully, and understanding him made it harder, not easier, to keep the careful distance she had promised herself she would maintain. Then, on a gray Thursday morning 3 weeks after her arrival, everything changed. She was crossing the courtyard with a basket of linens when a carriage rattled through the front gates, mud-splattered and unfamiliar, and a heavy-set man in a dark coat climbed down without waiting to be announced. Eliza recognized him instantly, and her blood turned to ice. "Mr. Coleman," she whispered, the basket nearly slipping from her arms. He spotted her before she could retreat, his expression twisting into something cold and satisfied. "Miss Hart, how convenient to find you here. I had heard you'd taken employment at the castle, though I confess I did not believe it until now. Mr. Coleman, I have 3 more weeks before the deadline you set. Circumstances have changed." He withdrew a folded paper from his coat with theatrical slowness, clearly relishing the small crowd of servants who had begun to gather at the edges of the courtyard, drawn by the commotion. "I require immediate payment, today, or I shall be forced to pursue your family's remaining property, including the cottage your mother and brother currently occupy." "That is not what we agreed." Eliza's voice shook, humiliation burning through her, as she felt the weight of every servant's eyes upon her, whispers already beginning to ripple through the gathered staff. "You gave me until the end of the month." "I gave your father until the end of the month, before his unfortunate death left the debt unresolved, and frankly, riskier than I originally calculated." Coleman's eyes swept over her worn uniform with open contempt. "A housemaid's wages will take years to settle £300, Miss Hart. I have decided I am no longer willing to wait on the goodwill of a servant girl." The basket finally slipped from her arms, linen spilling across the wet stones, and Eliza felt tears burning behind her eyes, tears she refused to let fall in front of this man, in front of the growing crowd, in front of anyone. She had endured so much already, the hunger, the exhaustion, the humiliation of poverty pressing down on her from every direction, and now this man intended to strip away the last shred of dignity she had managed to preserve. "Please," she said quietly, hating herself for the plea even as it left her mouth. "I only need a few more weeks. I am saving everything I can. That is quite enough." The voice cut through the courtyard like a blade, and every servant present, Eliza included, turned toward the castle steps where Julian Ashcombe now stood, his expression carved from stone, his eyes fixed on Coleman, with an intensity that made the merchant visibly falter. "Your Grace." Coleman's confidence wavered, though he recovered quickly, offering a stiff bow. "Forgive the disturbance. This is a private matter, between myself and one of your servants. Nothing that occurs on my land during my working hours is a private matter, Mr. Coleman." Julian descended the steps slowly, each word measured and cold, and I find myself deeply curious why a man of business would choose to humiliate a young woman in a public courtyard rather than pursue proper legal channels, if he genuinely believed himself owed a debt. "The debt is quite real, Your Grace. £300, owed by the late Henry Hart, now the responsibility of his surviving family." "I see." Julian's gaze flicked briefly to Eliza, and something passed across his face too quickly for her to read, though it steadied her trembling hands nonetheless. "And you believed the appropriate way to collect this debt was to threaten a working woman in front of an audience, rather than sending correspondence through proper legal representation?" Coleman's face reddened. "I merely came to settle accounts." "Then settle them with me." Julian's voice did not rise, but it carried an authority that silenced the entire courtyard. "Send your documentation to my solicitor by the end of the week. Until then, you will leave my property, and you will not return to harass any member of my household again. Do I make myself clear?" Coleman opened his mouth as though to argue, took one look at the Duke's expression, and thought better of it. He climbed back into his carriage, with considerably less bravado than he had arrived with, muttering something about proper channels as the wheels rattled back through the gates. The courtyard remained frozen for a long moment after he disappeared, every servant staring at Eliza with a mixture of pity and fascination, before Mrs. Whitfield finally clapped her hands and ordered everyone back to their duties. Eliza knelt to gather the fallen linens with shaking hands, mortification burning through her chest, and she did not look up when a pair of polished boots stopped beside her. "Miss Hart." I am terribly sorry, Your Grace. She kept her eyes on the linens, unable to meet his gaze, unable to bear the thought of what she might find there. This should not have happened on your property. I will understand if you wish to dismiss me, given the disturbance. Stop! The single word carried such quiet force that she finally lifted her eyes to his. Whatever she expected to find there, it was not the gentleness that greeted her instead. You have done nothing wrong. A debt left by a dead man is not a crime committed by his daughter. You do not understand the full extent of it, she whispered, shame making the words nearly impossible to speak. It is not only 300 pounds. There are smaller debts as well. Tradesmen my father never settled before his passing. I have been trying to manage them quietly, but I fear it is more than I can ever repay on a housemaid's wages. Something shifted in his expression, though she could not name what. Finish your work for today. We will speak further this evening, in the library. She did not know what to make of his tone, whether it promised comfort or further complication, and she spent the remainder of the day in a state of nervous distraction, her hands performing familiar tasks while her mind circled endlessly around the courtyard scene, around Coleman's threats, around the strange steadiness in Julian's voice when he had defended her before the entire household. That evening, she arrived at the library to find him waiting, a single candle burning low on the table between them, his expression unusually careful, as though he had spent the hours since the courtyard incident, choosing his words with great precision. I have made inquiries, he said without preamble, regarding your father's estate and its remaining debts. Eliza's breath caught. Your Grace, I did not ask you to involve yourself. I am aware you did not ask. He held up a hand, not unkindly, and continued. But I could not, in good conscience, allow a member of my household to be threatened on my own land while I stood by, claiming indifference. Coleman's debt has been settled in full, as of this afternoon, along with 2 smaller accounts owed to tradesmen in your village. The room seemed to tilt beneath her. Settled, you mean? You paid them. I did. Your Grace, I cannot possibly accept such a thing. 300 pounds, and more besides. It is an enormous sum, and I have no way to repay you. Not on a housemaid's wages, not in years. I did not ask for repayment. His voice remained steady, though something flickered behind his eyes that suggested the conversation cost him more effort than his composed exterior revealed. I ask only that you continue your work here, and that you allow yourself, occasionally, to eat a proper meal, and sleep more than a few hours each night. That is the entirety of what I require in return. She stared at him, searching his face for the trick she was certain must be hidden somewhere within his offer, because kindness on this scale did not exist without a price. Not in the world she had come to know since her father's death. Why would you do this? You barely know me. I am nothing to you, merely a servant among dozens in your household. That is not entirely accurate. He held her gaze steadily, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something raw and unguarded pass across his features, something that looked almost like fear, though what a man of his position had to fear from a housemaid, she could not begin to imagine. You are not nothing to me, Miss Hart. I suspect you have not been nothing to me since the night I found you in this very room, and I have spent every day since trying, unsuccessfully, to convince myself otherwise. Eliza's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it. Your Grace, I do not know what to say to that. You need not say anything tonight. He straightened, the familiar composure returning to his posture, though his eyes remained soft. It is enough, for now, that the debt no longer hangs over your family, and that you are free to make your own choices without the shadow of ruin forcing your hand. Whatever else exists between us, I would rather you choose it freely, or not at all, than feel obligated by a debt you did not ask me to settle. She left the library that night in a daze, her mind unable to reconcile the enormity of what had happened. The debt lifted, the fear that had haunted her every waking moment, suddenly, impossibly, gone. But beneath the relief lay something else entirely, a fragile, terrifying hope that had nothing to do with money at all, and everything to do with the way Julian Ashcombe had looked at her in the candlelight, as though she were something precious rather than something owed. She did not sleep that night either, though for the first time in weeks, it was not fear that kept her awake. News of the courtyard scene spread through the castle faster than fire through dry grass, and by the following morning, Every servant from the scullery to the stables seemed to know some version of what had happened, though the details grew more distorted with each retelling. By the time the story reached the stable yard, it was no longer a duke defending a servant from an unjust creditor. It had become, in the mouths of the more spiteful staff, something far uglier. Eliza first became aware of the rumor's true shape when she entered the servants' hall for the midday meal and felt the room go quiet around her, dozens of eyes flicking toward her, before darting away again, whispers trailing in her wake like smoke. She took her seat beside Charlotte, who offered a tight, sympathetic smile that did nothing to ease the knot forming in Eliza's stomach. "What is being said?" Eliza asked quietly, though she already suspected she would not like the answer. Charlotte hesitated, glancing around before leaning close. "George in the stables has been telling anyone who will listen that His Grace paid your family's debts because you have been offering him certain favors in exchange." The blood drained from Eliza's face. "That is a filthy lie. I know that. Most sensible people know that." Charlotte's expression darkened, but George has never cared much for the truth, especially where it concerns anyone who receives attention he believes should belong to him. He has fancied himself close to the Duke's favor for years, running errands, currying whatever small notice he could manage. Your sudden position in the library has wounded his pride considerably. Eliza pushed her plate away, appetite gone entirely. She had known, in some distant corner of her mind, that accepting Julian's help carried risks beyond mere gratitude, but she had not fully considered how quickly kindness could be twisted into scandal, how easily a woman's reputation could be shredded by jealous tongues with nothing better to occupy them. She thought of her mother, of Edward, of the shame that would follow them even in their small village if such rumors traveled beyond the castle walls. The situation worsened over the following days. She began noticing the whispers more acutely, the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, the sly glances from footmen who had once ignored her entirely. George Pratt himself seemed to take particular pleasure in making pointed comments whenever their paths crossed, remarks disguised as pleasantries but laced with cruel implication. "Off to the library again, Miss Hart," he said one afternoon, blocking her path in the corridor with false politeness. "Must be exhausting work, keeping His Grace so thoroughly entertained." "I catalog books, Mr. Pratt, nothing more." She kept her voice steady, though her hands trembled at her sides. "I would ask you to keep your imagination to yourself. My imagination has little to do with it. The whole household has eyes, Miss Hart, and eyes see what they see. A poor girl arrives with nothing, and within a month, her family's debts vanish, and she spends her evenings alone with the Duke behind closed doors. Draw your own conclusions. There is nothing improper occurring, and you know that perfectly well." "Do I?" His smile turned unpleasant. "Or perhaps I simply know that men like His Grace do not part with hundreds of pounds without expecting something in return. I wonder what price you've agreed to pay, Miss Hart, and whether you'll still hold your head so high once he tires of you and tosses you back into the gutter you came from." Eliza pushed past him without another word, refusing to let him see how deeply his words had struck, though the moment she reached the privacy of the linen closet, she pressed a hand to her mouth and allowed herself several silent, furious tears. It was not only the cruelty of his words that wounded her, but the terrible fear buried beneath them, the fear that perhaps the rest of the household believed the same, that her hard-won position, her family's safety, her very reputation, now rested on a foundation the world had already decided was corrupt. She considered, briefly, requesting reassignment away from the library, away from any duty that placed her near Julian, in hopes the rumors might fade, without fuel to sustain them. But when she arrived that evening for their usual hours of cataloging, she found herself unable to voice the request, because the thought of retreating from his company entirely brought its own kind of ache, one that told her, uncomfortably, that George Pratt's accusations were not entirely without foundation, even if their crude interpretation was wrong. She had come to care for Julian Ashcombe. She could no longer deny that truth to herself, however dangerous it had become to acknowledge. Julian noticed her distraction immediately. "Something troubles you," he said, setting aside the ledger he had been reviewing. "You have barely spoken a word since you arrived, and you have shelved 3 volumes in entirely the wrong section." "It is nothing, Your Grace, merely tiredness." Eliza, her name, spoken without title for the first time, startled her into meeting his eyes. I have come to know you well enough these past weeks to recognize when you are hiding something. Please, tell me what has happened." The gentleness in his voice undid her carefully maintained composure, and before she could stop herself, the entire story spilled out. George Pratt's cruel insinuations, the whispers following her through every corridor, the shame she felt, not for anything she had done, but for what others assumed of her, simply because a duke had shown her kindness. Julian's expression grew darker with every word, though his anger, she noticed, was directed entirely outward, never once toward her. "This is unacceptable," he said when she finished, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "No member of my household will be permitted to speak of you, or treat you, in such a manner. Please, Your Grace, I would ask you not to intervene further. It will only worsen the rumors if you defend me too openly. I am already the subject of enough gossip. I care very little for gossip when it concerns your dignity." He rose from his chair, pacing the length of the library with restless energy. "I have spent this household's entire history maintaining careful distance from every servant beneath this roof, precisely to avoid situations such as this one. And yet I find myself unable to remain silent, while a man like George Pratt spreads filth about a woman who has done nothing but work herself to exhaustion, trying to save her family." Julian. His name left her lips before she could stop it, unfamiliar and daring on her tongue, and it silenced him instantly, his eyes finding hers with an intensity that stole the breath from her chest. "Whatever you decide, please consider what it will cost me if you act too visibly on my behalf. I have very little left in this world, beyond my reputation and my family's safety. I could not bear to lose either." He crossed the room slowly, and stopped before her, close enough that she could see the conflict warring plainly across his features. "I would never knowingly cause you harm, Eliza. You must believe that. But I also cannot stand idle, while you are made to suffer for kindness I chose to offer freely, of my own will, expecting nothing in return. Then what would you have me do?" "Trust me," he said quietly. "Allow me to handle this in a manner that protects you, rather than exposes you further." The following morning, without fanfare or public confrontation, George Pratt was summoned to the Duke's study. What passed between them, no one outside that room ever learned in detail, though George emerged pale and silent, and within the week he had accepted a position at a distant estate 2 counties away, a transfer arranged, the household quietly understood, at the Duke's personal recommendation and expense. The rumors did not vanish entirely, gossip rarely does, but without George's malicious fuel behind them, they gradually softened into background noise, then faded almost entirely as the household's attention shifted to other matters. What remained, unspoken but unmistakable, was a new understanding between Eliza and Julian, one neither of them had chosen to name aloud, but which both felt keenly in every shared glance across the dinner service, every quiet evening in the library, every moment their hands brushed while sorting through the same stack of books. She had come to Ashcombe Castle to save her family from ruin. She had not expected, in the process, to find herself falling for a man whose position made any future between them nearly impossible to imagine. A man whose title demanded a wife of noble birth, not a housemaid who had arrived with nothing but debt and desperation. She told herself, lying awake each night, that whatever existed between them could go no further than the walls of the library allowed. She told herself this, even as her heart insisted, with growing stubbornness, that it already had. Peace, Eliza soon learned, was a fragile thing, and hers lasted barely a month before it shattered entirely. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a boy from her village, who had walked 3 hours to reach the castle gates, his face pale with the weight of the news he carried. Eliza recognized her mother's handwriting immediately, shaky, and rushed in a way that made her stomach drop before she had even broken the seal. Edward had been arrested. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely hold the page steady enough to read. Her father, it seemed, had left behind more than the debt to Coleman. A business partner named Whitmore, a man Eliza had never met, claimed Henry Hart owed him a considerable sum from a failed shipping venture years earlier, a debt that had apparently transferred, upon her father's death, to his surviving male heir. Edward, only 14 years old, had been taken before a magistrate and now faced the very real possibility of debtor's prison unless the sum of £400 could be produced within 10 days. Eliza read the letter 3 times, before the full horror of it settled into her bones. 400 pounds. A sum even larger than Coleman's debt, and this time the threat did not hang over property or reputation, but over her brother's freedom, his safety, his very future. She thought of Edward's face, still soft with youth, trying so hard to be brave when she left for the castle, and something inside her broke open with a grief so sharp she could barely breathe through it. She did not go to Julian immediately. Shame held her back, the terrible weight of asking for help a second time, of proving George Pratt's cruel insinuations somehow true after all, that she was nothing but a burden dressed up as a servant, endlessly draining the Duke's generosity. She spent 2 full days trying to devise some solution of her own, calculating and recalculating her meager savings, considering desperate measures, selling what little remained of her mother's jewelry, seeking a loan from anyone in the village who might extend one, though she knew, even as she made these calculations, that none of it would be nearly enough in time. It was Charlotte who finally forced the truth from her, finding Eliza weeping quietly in the linen closet, on the 3rd day, the letter crumpled in her fist. "You must tell him," Charlotte said firmly, once Eliza had explained everything through broken, exhausted sobs. "Whatever pride keeps you from it, set it aside. Your brother's freedom matters more than your fear of appearing needy. I cannot ask him for 400 pounds, Charlotte. I already owe him more than I can ever repay. What kind of person continues taking without offering anything in return?" "The kind of person who has no other choice," Charlotte said gently. "And Eliza, I do not think he sees it as taking, not from what I have observed. I think that man would give you the entire estate if you asked for it, and count himself fortunate for the opportunity." Eliza knew, deep down, that Charlotte was right, though it did nothing to ease the terrible weight of shame that accompanied her, as she made her way to the library that evening, the letter clutched against her chest, like armor she desperately needed, but did not deserve. Julian looked up from his desk the moment she entered, his expression shifting instantly from welcome to concern, as he took in her red-rimmed eyes, her trembling hands. "Eliza, what has happened?" She could not speak at first, simply crossing the room and placing the letter before him, unable to voice the request herself. He read it in silence, his jaw tightening with each line, and when he finished, he set it down with careful, controlled movements that told her more about his fury than any outburst could have. "And this man Whitmore intends to imprison a child for a debt that was never his to begin with, simply because the law permits him to pursue the nearest available male heir. I do not know what to do." The words finally broke free, raw and desperate. "I have nothing left to give, Julian. I have already accepted more from you than I can ever hope to repay, and now I must ask for even more, and I hate myself for it. I truly do, because I know exactly what people will say, what they already believe about the two of us, and I cannot bear to prove them right by becoming nothing more than a burden you feel obligated to carry. Stop." He rose from his desk and crossed to where she stood, taking her trembling hands in his with a gentleness that stole whatever protest remained in her throat. "You are not a burden, Eliza. You have never been a burden. And there is something you do not yet know, something I have been trying to find the right moment to tell you." "What do you mean?" He led her to a chair, and once she was seated, he retrieved a small wooden box from his desk drawer, setting it before her with careful hands. Inside, she found a stack of papers, receipts and correspondence spanning several weeks, each one documenting a payment, a settlement, a debt, quietly resolved. "I did not stop with Coleman," he said softly. "I made inquiries into your father's full financial history, the very week I first paid his debt to that merchant. I discovered 3 smaller accounts owed to tradesmen in your village, which I settled immediately. I discovered a debt to your family's landlord, threatening eviction within the year, which I also resolved, and 2 weeks ago, my solicitor informed me of a 4th debt, owed to a man named Whitmore, connected to a failed shipping venture your father invested in before his death." Eliza stared at the papers, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. "You knew about Whitmore already." "I did, and I had already begun the process of settling it, quietly, through my solicitor, precisely so you would never need to endure the terror of a letter such as this one. Unfortunately, Whitmore moved more quickly than expected, choosing to pursue your brother through the courts before my solicitor could complete the arrangement. But Eliza, The money is not the difficulty here. My solicitor has already secured Edward's release. The payment will be delivered to the magistrate within 2 days, well before the 10-day deadline. Your brother is safe." The relief that flooded through her was so overwhelming she nearly could not speak, tears spilling freely down her cheeks, though these were tears of a different nature entirely than the grief that had consumed her for days. "You have been settling my family's debts this entire time. Without telling me, without asking anything of me at all." "Yes. Why? Julian, please, I need to understand why. You are a duke. You owe my family nothing, and yet you have spent what must be nearly £1,000 now, quietly, without a word of acknowledgement expected in return. What could possibly explain such generosity toward a housemaid you barely knew a month ago?" He was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing gentle circles across the back of her hand, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability she had never heard from him before, not once in all their weeks together. "Because the moment I found you in this library, reading in the candlelight despite every rule forbidding it, refusing to lie or beg or grovel when I confronted you, I recognized something in you I had not encountered in years: honesty, courage, a dignity that no amount of poverty or hardship had managed to strip away. I told myself, that night, that it meant nothing, that I was simply curious about an unusual servant, nothing more. But Eliza, I have not been able to stop thinking of you since, not for a single day, and every debt I settled not out of obligation or pity, but because I could not bear the thought of you suffering, when it was within my power to prevent it. I have fallen for you, completely, and rather helplessly, if I am entirely honest, and I no longer know how to pretend otherwise, regardless of what such an admission might cost either of us." Eliza sat in stunned silence, the weight of his confession settling over her like something both terrifying and impossibly precious. She had suspected, in quiet, guarded moments, that his feelings ran deeper than simple kindness, but hearing it spoken aloud, so plainly, and without pretense, undid something in her chest she had spent weeks trying desperately to keep guarded. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. "You need not say anything tonight." He lifted her hand gently, pressing a soft kiss against her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. "It is enough, for now, that your brother is safe, and that you know the truth of my feelings, freely given, with no expectation of anything in return. Whatever you decide to do with that truth, Eliza, is entirely yours to choose." She left the library that night with her mind and heart in complete disarray, relief for Edward's safety tangled inseparably with the enormity of Julian's confession, and she understood, walking back to her small room in the servants' quarters, that whatever came next between them would change everything, for better or for worse, and there was no longer any path that led backward to the careful distance she had once believed she could maintain. News that Edward had been released reached Eliza 3 days later, carried by the same weary messenger boy, this time with a note from her mother, filled with relief and gratitude, so overwhelming, the ink had smudged from tears. Eliza read it standing in the courtyard, sunlight breaking through the clouds for the first time in weeks, and she allowed herself, finally, to feel the full weight of everything that had happened lift from her shoulders. Her brother was safe. Her family's debts, all of them, had been settled. And a duke had confessed, in the quiet privacy of his library, that he had fallen in love with her. She did not know what to do with any of it. The following days passed in a strange, suspended quality, as though the entire household sensed that something significant had shifted, even if no one outside the library fully understood what it was. Julian did not press her for an answer, did not seek her out with expectant eyes or pointed questions, and his patience, she realized, was its own form of respect, a recognition that whatever she chose next must be chosen freely, without the pressure of debt or obligation clouding her judgment. She spent long hours turning the matter over in her mind while she worked, scrubbing floors and mending linens, with hands that moved automatically, while her thoughts remained entirely elsewhere. She thought of the vast difference in their positions, the impossibility of a housemaid becoming anything more to a duke than a servant he had shown unusual kindness toward. She thought of what society would say, the scandal that would follow them both if she allowed her heart to lead her somewhere so far beyond her station. She thought, too, of her own fear, the terrible vulnerability of loving a man whose world could crush her so completely if his feelings ever changed, if the novelty of her honesty and courage eventually wore thin against the weight of everything that separated them. But beneath all of that fear, she found something steadier, something that had been growing quietly within her since the very first night in the library, when a stranger's anger had not quite masked the curiosity beneath it. She thought of every kindness he had shown her, not as a duke performing charity, but as a man who noticed, who cared, who had spent weeks quietly dismantling every obstacle standing between her family and safety, expecting nothing in return, beyond the simple privilege of her company in the evenings. She thought of the way he listened when she spoke, truly listened, in a manner no one in her life had offered her since her father's death. She thought of the warmth in his eyes that had nothing to do with pity, and everything to do with genuine regard. A week after his confession, she found him alone in the library once more, and this time, she did not wait for him to speak first. "I have been thinking of nothing else since the night you told me the truth," she said, standing just inside the doorway, her heart pounding so loudly, she was certain he could hear it across the room. "I have tried to convince myself that whatever exists between us cannot possibly survive the distance our positions demand. I have told myself, over and over, that a duke and a housemaid have no business feeling what we feel, that it can only end in scandal, or heartbreak, or both." Julian set down the book he had been holding, rising slowly, his expression carefully guarded, as though bracing himself for whatever came next. "And what have you concluded?" "That I am tired," she said simply, "of allowing fear to make my decisions for me. I spent months terrified of debt, terrified of losing my family, terrified of a future I could not control, and that fear very nearly cost me the chance to recognize something real when it finally arrived. I do not know what the future holds for either of us, Julian. I do not know how the world will receive whatever this becomes, but I know that when I am in this room with you, I feel something I have not felt since before my father died. I feel safe, I feel seen, and I find I no longer wish to spend my life pretending otherwise, whatever the cost." The distance between them closed swiftly, and when he took her hands in his eyes carried none of the careful restraint she had grown accustomed to, only open, unguarded warmth. "You must understand what you are choosing, Eliza. Society will not make this easy for either of us. There will be whispers, judgment, perhaps even cruelty from those who believe a housemaid has no right to stand beside a duke. I have survived worse than whispers," she said, and found, to her own surprise, that she believed it completely. "I have survived hunger and grief, and the terror of watching everyone I love threatened by debts that were never mine to carry. I think I can survive gossip, particularly if I do not have to face it alone." "You will never have to face anything alone again," he said quietly, his hand rising to gently cup her face. "Not if you allow me the privilege of standing beside you." What followed in the weeks that came after was not a fairy tale transformation, not an instant erasure of every difficulty their difference in position created, but something steadier and more honest than that. Julian spoke with his solicitor about the proper, careful steps necessary to introduce Eliza to society, not as a servant elevated by charity, but as a woman whose character and courage had earned her place beside him. Mrs. Whitfield, once she understood the depth of the Duke's intentions, became an unexpected ally, quietly assisting Eliza's transition, with a warmth that surprised them both. Charlotte wept with joy when Eliza finally confided the full truth, insisting she had known from the very beginning that something remarkable was unfolding between them. There were difficult conversations, certainly. Some members of the household staff struggled to adjust to the shifting dynamics, and a handful of the local gentry, when word eventually spread beyond the castle walls, offered pointed comments about propriety and appropriate matches that Julian addressed with the same quiet, unwavering authority he had once used to defend Eliza against Coleman in the courtyard. But none of it shook what had grown steadily between them, because it had never been built on convenience or obligation, only on the simple, stubborn truth that two people, against every expectation placed upon them, had genuinely found something worth protecting in each other. Eliza's mother and Edward visited the castle for the first time nearly 2 months after Edward's release, and Eliza watched, with a fullness in her chest she had not known she was capable of feeling, as Julian knelt to speak with her brother at eye level, asking about his interests, his studies, treating the boy with a seriousness and respect that spoke louder than any grand gesture could have. Her mother wept again, this time from a joy so complete it left her nearly speechless, watching her daughter, who had arrived at this castle, burdened by debt and desperation, now standing confidently beside a man who looked at her as though she were the most precious thing in his entire world. On the evening Julian finally asked her to marry him, he did not choose an elaborate ballroom or a grand public gesture. He chose the library instead, the very room where their story had begun, a single candle burning between them just as it had that first night, though everything else about the moment stood in complete contrast to their beginning. There was no anger between them now, no misunderstanding, no fear of dismissal or ruin. There was only steady, certain devotion, built patiently over months of quiet kindness and honest conversation. "I once told you," he said, kneeling before her with a small ring held carefully in his palm, "that I would never require repayment for anything I offered you. I meant that then, and I mean it still. Whatever you choose tonight, Eliza, you owe me nothing. But I find I cannot continue keeping this particular truth to myself any longer. I love you, completely, and without reservation, and I would count myself the most fortunate man in England if you would agree to remain beside me, not as a servant, not as someone indebted to my generosity, but as my wife, my equal, and my partner in everything that lies ahead." Eliza knelt before him, taking his face gently in her hands, tears of joy blurring her vision as she finally allowed herself to fully embrace the future she had once believed impossible. "I came to this castle believing my only worth lay in the debts I owed, and the labor I could offer in exchange for survival. You taught me otherwise, Julian. You taught me that I was worth saving, not because of what I could repay, but simply because I deserved kindness, and dignity, and love, freely given. Yes, I will marry you. Not because you rescued me from ruin, but because somewhere in the process of rescuing my family, you also rescued the part of me that had forgotten how to hope." Their wedding took place the following spring, in the very courtyard where Coleman had once threatened to strip away everything Eliza held dear, transformed now with flowers and warmth and the genuine joy of a household that had watched their story unfold, from cold beginnings to something remarkable. Mrs. Whitfield cried openly. Charlotte served as one of the witnesses, beaming with pride. Edward, now taller and steadier than the frightened boy who had once faced a magistrate's judgment, stood proudly beside his sister as she walked toward the man who had quietly, patiently, without ever demanding recognition, paid every debt that had once threatened to destroy everything she loved. Eliza Hart had arrived at Ashcombe Castle, believing she was there to pay a debt. She left it, in time, as its duchess, having learned that the truest debts in life are rarely measured in coin, but in kindness, offered without condition, and in love that asks for nothing in return, except the simple privilege of being trusted completely. Life as Duchess of Ashcombe did not erase the years Eliza had spent scrubbing floors and counting coins, and she never wished it to. She kept, tucked away in a small drawer of her writing desk, the worn boots Julian had first left outside her door, a quiet reminder of how far they had both traveled to reach this place together. But peace, she was learning, rarely stayed uninterrupted for long, and less than a year into their marriage, a new challenge arrived at Ashcombe's gates, one that tested not the strength of her love for Julian, but the strength of her place within the world he had brought her into. A distant cousin of Julian's late father, a man named Reginald Ashcombe, arrived unannounced one autumn afternoon, claiming a right to contest the legitimacy of the marriage, and by extension, any future claim Eliza's children might one day hold to the estate. He was smooth-tongued and carefully dressed, presenting himself to the local magistrates and to several members of the peerage as a concerned relative, protecting the family's honor. Though Eliza recognized the greed beneath his polished manners the moment he stepped into the castle hall. "A housemaid," Reginald said coolly, looking Eliza over as though she were still wearing her old uniform, rather than the fine gown she now wore as mistress of the house. Elevated to duchess through nothing more than sentiment and a moment of weakness. The courts will have opinions on that, I assure you, particularly once certain details of your family's past debts become more widely known. My wife's character is not a matter for debate in my own home, Julian said, his voice carrying the same cold authority Eliza remembered from the courtyard confrontation with Coleman, though this time she stood beside him rather than behind him, unwilling to shrink from the challenge. And I would advise you to choose your next words with considerably more care. I mean no insult, cousin, only caution. Marriages built on charity rather than proper alliance have a way of unraveling under scrutiny, and I would hate to see the Ashcombe name dragged through scandal when a quiet annulment could spare everyone considerable embarrassment. Eliza felt the old fear rising in her chest, the familiar terror of losing everything she had built, but this time, standing beside Julian rather than facing the world alone, she found she was no longer willing to let fear dictate her response. "Mr. Ashcombe, I built my life on hard work long before I ever met your cousin, and I have earned my place in this household through honesty, not deception. If you intend to challenge our marriage through the courts, I welcome the scrutiny, because I have nothing to hide, and I suspect the same cannot be said of you." Something flickered across Reginald's face, a flash of unease quickly masked, and Eliza pressed forward, sensing weakness beneath his bravado. "In fact, I recall my husband's solicitor mentioning irregularities in your own accounts some months ago. Debts owed to several tradesmen in London that you have been rather slow to settle. Perhaps the courts should examine your financial conduct as closely as you seem eager to examine mine." Julian's eyes flickered with quiet approval, and Reginald's composure cracked further still, his earlier confidence evaporating as he realized the woman before him was not the frightened, vulnerable servant he had expected to intimidate. "I did not come here to be threatened. Nor did I invite you into my home to threaten my wife," Julian replied evenly. "I suggest you return to London, Reginald, and reconsider whatever scheme you had hoped to accomplish here. Should you pursue this matter through the courts, you will find my solicitors considerably more thorough in examining your own affairs than you anticipated." Reginald left within the hour, his carriage disappearing down the same road Coleman had once traveled in disgrace. And though he made vague threats of legal action in the weeks that followed, nothing ever materialized beyond a few unpleasant rumors that faded as quickly as they had arrived, unable to withstand the genuine respect Eliza had earned among the household staff, the tenants, and increasingly, the wider community who had watched her transform Ashcombe's charitable efforts into something far more substantial than mere tradition. She used her position, in the years that followed, to establish a fund for tenant families facing debts they could not manage alone, remembering vividly what it felt like to watch a merchant's carriage arrive, with ruin trailing behind it. She trained young women from the village in household management and literacy, offering them the same opportunities that had once changed the course of her own life. Julian supported every initiative without hesitation, watching with quiet pride as the woman he had fallen for in a candlelit library grew into a duchess whose compassion reshaped an entire estate. Edward, now grown and educated through opportunities his sister's marriage had made possible, eventually took a position managing the estate's shipping interests, the same industry that had once nearly destroyed him through Whitmore's cruel debt collection. Their mother lived out her remaining years in a comfortable cottage on Ashcombe land, visited often by grandchildren who never knew a moment of the hunger and fear that had once defined their mother's childhood. Years later, when Eliza's own daughter asked her, curled beside the library fire on a winter evening, how she had come to marry a duke, Eliza would smile and tell the story simply, without embellishment. She had taken a job at a castle to pay her family's debts, she explained, and found, quite unexpectedly, a man who paid every one of them without ever asking for anything in return, except the chance to know her honestly, and to love her freely, exactly as she was. It was not, she always reminded her daughter, a story about rescue. It was a story about two people who found, in each other, a courage neither had known they still possessed, and a home, built not on debt or obligation, but on the steady, patient work of choosing each other, again and again, long after the original debt had been forgotten by everyone, except the two people who understood what it had truly cost, and what it had ultimately given them both.